I have to say, this is a very familiar space. I lecture in this room every Wednesday. It never looks as spectacular or as innovating as this, but it's nice to come back into a familiar space to talk to you today about this theme that we've got at the top here of shifting paradigms. And the realm that I want to focus on in terms of shifting paradigms is the way that I think conflict in the world is fundamentally changing, particularly in the last 20 years or so. And I think we're also seeing paradigm shifts in the way that we're responding to conflict. And perhaps the continent at the moment that best represents these shifting paradigms in how we respond to violence is Africa. And what I want to, explore in this very brief presentation today are some of the trends that we're seeing in Africa towards dealing with new forms of violence, particularly in the last 2 decades. But what I'm going to talk about, I think, has a relevance that's much wider than Africa. I think there is resonance here for places like Syria. There's situations in Eastern Europe still to this day, and parts of Asia that I think also could learn perhaps some things from some of the African cases that I want to speak to you about here. To give you one example of the kind of new African approaches to responding to things like genocide and mass conflict, we've had an amazing example in the last 10 years or so, in the case of Rwanda. This is a country that, of course, suffered an enormous genocide in 1994. And in the last 10 years, Rwanda has used a series of community-based courts called Gacaca to prosecute nearly 400,000 genocide suspects. Gacaca is a series of community-based jurisdictions with judges elected by their local population who have prosecuted these genocide suspects in the same places where they committed crimes in 1994. This system of community-based courts, it's looked at 400,000 suspects, it's dealt with nearly 1 million different trials. It's cost the Rwandan government only $50 million in the last 10 years to go through this trial process. And there's a huge debate at the moment in many African countries about the extent to which Rwanda's experience of dealing with genocide might represent some kind of model for other societies, or at least throw up some ideas about how we might be able to deal with these cases of mass violence. I want to give you a snapshot of this kind of community-based approach to dealing with mass conflict, which I'm going to pick up again in just a moment. I've just come back from both Rwanda and Uganda in the last sort of 4 or 5 months, and I've been making a radio program interviewing people who lived through mass conflict. In the Rwandan case, they lived through the genocide. In the Ugandan case, we're talking about people who lived through the violence between the Ugandan army and the Lord's Resistance Army, the infamous LRA. Interviewing people about how they have come to terms with the past and what sorts of processes have their own communities generated to try and deal with mass conflict. And one of the cases that we look at in this radio program that I've been making centers on a man called Telus Paul, who's a middle-aged Hutu man. He lives in a small village in the southeastern corner of Rwanda. During the genocide, he rescued a Tutsi woman called Mathilde. At great personal risk to himself, he took Mathilde into his own home. And even though there were threats against him for this courageous act, he continued, along with his family, to protect Mathilde all the way through the genocide. We interviewed Telus Paul for the radio program, and he tells the risks that he took to rescue Mathilde in this particular way. We interviewed Mathilde, who talks about her enormous gratitude for the courage that Telus Paul showed during the genocide. But we also interviewed Mathilde's husband, Philippe, who's a very urbane man. He wears very sensible wire-rimmed glasses. When we interviewed him, he said, look, I have a story that is slightly complex, but you need to capture this. And if you can share it in your radio program, that would be great. He said, it's true that Telus Paul is responsible for saving my wife, Mathilde. But I recently discovered something else about Telus Paul that perhaps is even more important. And Philippe told this story of going to the local Gacaca court in his community on the day that Telus Paul stood up in front of a gathering of about 150 people, just like you are here today. And Telus Paul confessed to killing a range of people during the genocide, including Philippe's own father. And in the radio program, Philippe pours his heart out and tells how conflicted he was to stand in this community courtroom, out in a sort of village courtyard, and hear Telus Paul essentially confess to killing Philippe's father. And Philippe's saying, what do I do with this? This is the man who we have always lauded as having rescued my wife during the genocide, but here he is standing in front of us confessing to killing my father. And so the radio program tries to wrestle with the complexity that someone like Philippe feels in this particular moment. But Philippe goes on to tell the story of how crucial Gacaca was in extracting this confession from Telus Paul so that the truth was known about what he'd done. Philippe said that he was one of those genocide survivors who insisted that there should be justice for people like Telus Paul. But Philippe crucially also said that it was possible for him personally to now forgive Telus Paul for the crimes that he'd committed. This didn't mean that justice didn't need to be done, but it meant that through forgiveness there would be a way for Philippe as an individual and his family to move on to something like a productive future. But Philippe talks specifically about the importance of this community-based process that delivers accountability, but also pursues things like truth, forgiveness, and reconciliation. What we're seeing in cases like Gacaca and similar processes in countries like Uganda and the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo and in South Sudan and other parts of Africa at the moment is what I think is a paradigm shift in the way that we understand conflict and how we think that it should be responded to. What we've seen in the last 20 years, in my opinion, is a fundamentally different form of violence from what we saw in most parts of the world beforehand. We're no longer living in a world where conflict takes place from a top-down perspective, where it's only about elites giving orders and violence ensuing. We're not talking about necessarily Holocaust-style conflict, which is about a small cadre of leaders who essentially control the way that violence plays out. Since the Cold War, we've had to deal with much more decentralized, much messier conflict that involves rebel groups, paramilitary organizations, vigilante groups, and crucially everyday perpetrators who come from local communities, who in the case of Rwanda, for example, everyday people who picked up a machete and killed people that they knew extremely intimately, killed their neighbors, killed their friends, and in some cases killed their family members. This is the new kind of violence that I think we've had to wrestle with, not just in Africa, but in other parts of the world in the last 20 years or so. The problem is that at the moment, much of the international community is still stuck in an old perspective of how conflict plays out and how we're supposed to respond to conflict. There's a perception in the international community still that violence happens top down. And so when we respond to mass conflict, we simply have to respond to that type of violence. And that's why we see international criminal tribunals established to prosecute elite perpetrators. It's why we see UN peacekeeping missions that have a mandate essentially to deal with national conflict and to try and stabilize nations and regions, but with very little understanding of the need to deal with this community level component of conflict, and particularly to deal with the legacies of everyday people picking up machetes and committing crimes, and all of the ramifications that that has for communities coming to terms with the past. Underpinning this international idea of how we're supposed to respond to conflict is an emphasis on outsiders doing the difficult work of post-conflict reconstruction. So what we're seeing in the international community at the moment is an insistence on external actors getting involved in things like justice and reconstruction. Institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF. And the idea typically is that you get external actors in to help societies deal with the past because they're somehow more neutral or more impartial. I think underpinning this international paradigm of responding to conflict is on the one hand an old view of the way that violence happens, namely a top-down approach, but also this insistence that it must be international actors who fundamentally have to get involved. And within that, I think there's a distrust of local actors. In the international mindset, I think there's an emphasis on the idea that you can't trust locals to deal with their own reconstruction because they were part of the problem to begin with. And that distrust, I think, infuses much of the international thinking at the moment. What we're seeing in countries like Rwanda, Uganda, and Congo, though, is a very strong statement that that international way of dealing with conflict doesn't work any longer. It doesn't wrestle with the direct consequences of the kinds of conflict that these African countries have lived through. There's a sense that, yes, we do have to deal with elite perpetrators, because even in a case like Rwanda, where hundreds of thousands of everyday people were involved in the violence, political and military leaders did still play a role. So what's happening in Africa is not a throwing away entirely of the old way of thinking. It's simply saying there has to be a new dimension. And the new dimension now is the community level. How do we deal with perpetrators who live in our midst in communities, and how do we deal with the consequences of conflict that our communities are wrestling with on a daily basis? What comes through cases like Rwanda, Uganda, and Congo very strongly is firstly a sense that there has to be accountability for everyday perpetrators. And it doesn't matter how junior or how local they might seem. The fact that someone picked up a machete and committed a crime during this mass conflict and now has come back into the community and probably lives side by side with victims and survivors means that that person has to be held accountable, regardless of how insignificant in the chain of command that person might seem. There's also a strong emphasis in Rwanda, Uganda, and Congo, and I've seen this constantly through the 10 years of research that I've been doing on these processes, an emphasis on the need for truth. People saying we need community-based processes that allow us to understand how the conflict happened right here, in our village, in our town. We know the national story. Many Rwandan survivors will say, we know what happened nationwide in 1994. But what we don't know is exactly what happened in this place. Who killed whom and how? And crucially, where are the bodies buried? And that desire for local truth underpins a process like Gacaca. Many communities in these African countries are also saying, you know what? It's not enough to just deliver accountability for those who committed crimes in the past. And it's not enough to just discover the truth about what happened. But we also need something like reconciliation. Because ultimately, we live in the types of societies where people have to come back and live side by side. We don't have a choice about the kind of future community that we end up living in. We're talking about agricultural communities, subsistence farming. There isn't the space for communities like Hutu and Tutsi to divide themselves. People ultimately come back and live side by side. And so coexistence and reconciliation are key precepts underpinning the kind of community-based practices that we're seeing in Africa at the moment. There's a desire to wrestle with the intricacies of conflict through these community-based practices that I don't think is being represented in the international arena at the moment. And that's why I describe this as a paradigm shift. There's a fundamentally different understanding of how conflict happens, that it involves elites, but it also involves day-to-day people. And there's a paradigm shift going on in terms of how we respond to conflict, and an understanding that it's not enough to just deal at the national or the international level. It has to wrestle with what's happening in villages and towns and ultimately in communities one by one. And part of this paradigm shift that's coming through the African cases at the moment is also a sense that we have to do away with these ideas of neutrality and impartiality. And we have to do away with these ideas that it's only international actors that can ultimately do an effective job of responding to conflict. Because the message that's coming loud and clear out of cases like Rwanda and Uganda at the moment is a sense that communities themselves that live through conflict also possess the qualities and the capacities necessary to deal with violence. And it's crucial to emphasize the agency and the innovation of local communities themselves. And in many ways, there's a fundamental suspicion of outsiders. There's a suspicion of international actors. They're not seen as neutral. They're not seen as impartial. You listen to Rwandans and Ugandans talk about the conflict of the past, and more often than not, they'll say, you know what, international actors were part of the problem. In Rwanda in 1994, the international community abandoned us, people will say. The peacekeeping missions sat by and watched as people were hacked to death in their hundreds of thousands. And in Uganda, people will say international actors supported either the Ugandan government or the LRA. So who's neutral here? Who's impartial here? There's a distrust of this idea that internationals are somehow more neutral in their dealings with conflict zones, and an emphasis on local people taking charge of their own situation in very messy environments and doing things ultimately for themselves. The clock has vanished here, so I have no idea how much time I have left. Can someone give me a broad estimate of, I have 5 minutes? Fantastic, that's perfect. I panicked there. This is the danger of getting an academic up front to kind of launch an event like this, is that you know we have a capacity to talk way beyond what we actually need to. Why is this paradigm shift exciting? You can see I'm excited about. Why do I think you should be excited about it? It's because I think the message that's coming out of Africa at the moment is, regardless of how drastic these conflicts of the past have been, regardless of the damage that has been done to the communal fabric of people's lives, there is still the capacity for local populations to recognize the intricacies of community-based conflict and to do accountability, truth, and reconciliation on their own terms. That is a message that's coming out of Central Africa, and I think it has a resonance far beyond that. Now, it won't surprise you to hear that there is a huge pushback in the international community against this paradigm shift. Because this is what happens when paradigms have become constructed. There are all sorts of interests and agendas that get built into it. So there has been an enormous amount of international criticism of the ways in which countries like Rwanda, Uganda, and Congo have tried to deal with these kind of community-based problems that I've described. And if you read any human rights reports on Central Africa in the last 10 years, you will see a million criticisms of these community-based practices. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International froth at the mouth in saying something like Gacaca in Rwanda, well, that's not a serious justice system. What about due process? What about lawyers? How can you have locally elected judges do the job of accountability? It's impossible. The whole system will explode. There'll be mob violence. That was the prediction from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International when Rwanda decided to use a community-based court system. What's going on here, I think, is that many international actors don't get it. They don't get the fact that the world has changed. In the last 20 years, violence has manifested in different ways, and we need new solutions. Rwanda took an enormous risk in using the local population itself to try and deal with the problems of the past. And Gacaca and these other community-based processes have had every problem conceivable, so I'm certainly not romanticizing them. There have been enormous challenges. But at the heart of these practices was the recognition that it wasn't good enough to just ignore the crimes that had been committed in the community. Someone from Human Rights Watch recently said to me, it would have been preferable to have had an amnesty for all genocide perpetrators rather than using Gacaca. That's how angry he was about local actors taking justice into their own hands. It's ironic. A human rights group so keen on accountability around the world believed that the best response in Rwanda was to simply throw the gates of the prisons open and let the genocide perpetrators go home. The message coming out of Central Africa at the moment is that's not good enough. We have to live with perpetrators in our midst. It's not enough for us to just ignore the crimes of the past. We have to find more creative responses. That, I think, is a significant change in the way that we think about conflict. We think about the way that justice, truth, and reconciliation can be done. And to my mind, it's got a resonance far beyond the African cases I've talked about here, because this kind of conflict that involves everyday perpetrators is something that we're seeing all around the world at the moment. Thanks very much.